Welcome to this journey through one of the most faithfully maintained vigils ever kept in the Ozark Plateau. In the years when winter nights were dark and long, when a light in a window meant warmth and safety and human presence, when keeping watch through cold months was both duty and comfort, against the isolation that frontier winters brought, there appeared a light that burned every winter night in a cabin window, tended with perfect regularity and care, maintained by someone who kept their vigil with absolute dedication, despite the fact that no living person occupied the cabin or had occupied it for years. Leave a comment where you're watching from as we approach the window, where the light still burns. This video is a work of fiction, created solely for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. Before we see that light burning in the darkness, consider what lights in windows meant on the frontier and why their presence or absence communicated so much to neighbors and travelers. A lit window at night indicated occupancy, warmth, wakefulness. Someone was home, someone was tending the fire, someone was maintaining the household functions that kept frontier life viable. An unlit window meant either that inhabitants were sleeping, or that the building was abandoned, or that something had gone wrong. People learned to read windows, to notice which ones showed light at what hours, to recognize the patterns that indicated normal life versus abnormal situations requiring investigation, which made a light that burned with perfect regularity in an abandoned cabin so profoundly disturbing. It suggested presence where no presence should exist, suggested maintenance and care being provided by someone or something that had no legitimate reason to be there, suggested a vigil being kept for purposes that no one living could explain or understand. The year 1870 marked a period of established settlement and relative stability in the Ozark Plateau, 25 years after the end of the frontier period, and 5 years after the Civil War had concluded. The area around Cedar Ridge consisted of perhaps 30 families, scattered across several square miles of rolling terrain, connected by trails and roads that allowed regular contact and commerce, no longer as isolated as previous generations had been, but still remote enough that neighbors knew each other and paid attention to each other's affairs. The Morrison cabin sat on a small bench of land overlooking Cedar Creek, positioned to catch southern sun and sheltered from north winds by a rising ridge behind it. The cabin had been built in the 1840s by Thomas Morrison and his wife Eleanor, who had raised 4 children there before all had grown and moved to settlements farther west in pursuit of cheaper land and opportunity. Thomas died in 1867, and Eleanor followed in 1868, leaving the cabin empty, but maintained by neighbors who kept an eye on it, in case any of the Morrison children should return to claim it. The cabin stood empty through 1868 and 1869, slowly deteriorating as unoccupied structures do, but fundamentally sound and theoretically habitable if someone chose to move in. The property remained unclaimed. The Morrison children had established themselves elsewhere and showed no interest in returning to the old homestead, and the cabin existed in a state of limbo, neither abandoned nor occupied, neither falling to ruin nor being maintained. The winter of 1869-1870 brought the first observation of the light. A neighbor named Samuel Carter, passing by the Morrison cabin on a December evening while returning from visiting another household, noticed a warm glow in the cabin's south-facing window, the light of what appeared to be a candle or small lamp burning inside the structure. His immediate assumption was that one of the Morrison children had returned to occupy the cabin, and he made a mental note to stop by the next day to welcome whoever had come back. But when Carter visited the following morning, he found the cabin empty, its door still secured with the simple latch that had been in place since Eleanor's death, its interior cold and showing no signs of recent occupancy. The hearth was cold. No ashes suggested recent fire. No footprints marked the dust on the floor. No disturbance indicated anyone had been inside. Yet Carter was certain he had seen a light in the window the previous evening. Not a reflection or a trick of moonlight, but the unmistakable warm glow of a flame burning inside the cabin. Carter mentioned the observation to neighbors, suggesting that perhaps someone had been in the cabin briefly the previous evening and had left before morning. But others who lived closer to the Morrison place reported seeing the light on multiple evenings, always in the same window, always appearing shortly after sunset and burning until sometime after midnight, before extinguishing. The pattern was too regular, too consistent to be explained by occasional visitors who happened to be in the cabin for a few hours. In early January 1870, several families organized a coordinated observation to determine who was entering the cabin to light the candle each evening. Groups positioned themselves at various points around the Morrison property with clear views of the cabin and its approaches, maintaining watch from before sunset until well after the light appeared in the window. The light appeared on schedule shortly after sunset, a warm, steady glow in the south window visible from several hundred yards away. But no one approached the cabin. No one was seen entering or leaving. No movement was observed around the structure. The observers maintained their positions for several hours, watching both the cabin and the light that burned in its window, seeing the glow remain constant and steady, with the slight flickering that indicated a candle or lamp rather than reflected light or phosphorescence. After several hours, a group of men approached the cabin directly, moving from different directions to ensure no one could exit without being seen. They found the door still latched from outside, the windows secured, no signs of entry. One man carefully unlatched the door and pushed it open, and the observers saw the light they had been watching for hours extinguish the moment the door swung inward, as if someone inside had blown out a candle in response to the door opening. The interior of the cabin was dark, cold, and empty. The men entered cautiously, searched the single room thoroughly, and found no candle, no lamp, no source of light, no person living or dead, no evidence that anyone had been present. The hearth was cold, the floor was undisturbed, and the cabin was exactly as it had been on previous inspections, abandoned, unused, empty. The men emerged from the cabin confused and unsettled. They had all seen the light burning for hours, had watched it from multiple angles, had confirmed that it was emanating from inside the cabin rather than being a reflection or external source. Yet the cabin contained nothing that could have produced that light, and the light's extinction precisely when the door opened suggested awareness and response rather than some simple natural phenomenon. Over the following weeks, the pattern established itself with absolute regularity. Every night from sunset to some time between midnight and 1 in the morning, a light burned in the Morrison cabin's south window. Every night, the light appeared without anyone entering the cabin. Every night, it burned steadily and then extinguished itself at a consistent hour. And every inspection of the cabin during daylight or immediately after the light extinguished revealed the same empty, cold, unoccupied space with no source for the light and no explanation for its presence. The community's response evolved from curiosity to concern, to a kind of wary acceptance. The light was clearly not being produced by any living person in any conventional manner. Whether it represented some natural phenomenon not yet understood, some optical illusion created by specific atmospheric conditions, or something supernatural was debated extensively. But no consensus emerged beyond the acknowledgement that the light was real, was consistent, and could not be readily explained. Several theories were proposed to account for the light. Some suggested that the cabin's positioning created conditions where moonlight or starlight reflecting off snow or ice created the appearance of interior illumination. But the light appeared on cloudy nights when no moon or stars were visible, and it appeared during new moon periods when no significant natural light existed to reflect. Moreover, the light's warm yellow tone was distinctly that of flame, rather than the cooler blue-white of reflected starlight or moonlight. Others proposed that phosphorescent materials in the cabin's construction, certain woods or minerals that might glow after exposure to daylight, could create the appearance of a burning light. But this could not explain the light's consistent schedule, its appearance only after sunset, rather than whenever darkness fell, or its regular extinguishing around midnight, regardless of when sunset occurred. More supernatural explanations suggested that Eleanor Morrison's spirit had returned to tend the cabin, that she was maintaining the household routine she had followed in life, lighting a candle each evening and extinguishing it when she retired for the night. This theory had the advantage of explaining the light's human-like behaviors, its regular schedule, its response to the door opening, its placement in a window, where Eleanor would have placed a candle to provide light for evening tasks. The community's minister, Reverend John Patterson, visited the cabin in February to conduct a blessing and to pray for Eleanor's soul, hoping that if her spirit was indeed trapped maintaining a vigil at her former home, the blessing might release her to proper rest. The blessing was performed with solemnity and with genuine intent to provide peace to whatever presence maintained the light. But the light continued to appear the following evening, and every evening thereafter, unaffected by the blessing or the prayers. If Eleanor's spirit kept the vigil, she showed no inclination to abandon it in response to religious intervention. The light continued its nightly routine, as if the blessing had never occurred. Through the remainder of winter 1870 and into spring, the light maintained its pattern. But as days lengthened and sunset came later, the light's appearance time shifted to maintain its relationship to sunset rather than to clock time, appearing consistently approximately 15 to 20 minutes after the sun dropped below the horizon. This suggested that whatever controlled the light was responding to actual sunset rather than to a fixed hour, that it was attuned to the natural cycle of day and night rather than to human timekeeping. In April, as spring advanced and as the long winter nights gave way to shorter periods of darkness, the light's duration began to decrease. Where it had burned for 6 or 7 hours during the darkest winter months, from sunset around 5 p.m. until extinguishing around midnight, it now burned for progressively shorter periods as sunset came later and later in the evening. By late May, when sunset occurred around 8 p.m., the light burned for only 3 or 4 hours. And in June, as the summer solstice approached and as the shortest nights of the year arrived, the light ceased appearing entirely. The Morrison cabin sat dark through the brief summer nights, showing no illumination, maintaining no vigil. Whatever presence had kept watch through winter had apparently concluded its duty with the arrival of long days and short nights. The community expected that the light would return when winter came again, and the expectation was confirmed in October when the light resumed its nightly appearances shortly after sunset. The pattern was identical to what had been observed the previous winter. Steady glow in the south window, burning for hours before extinguishing itself around midnight, appearing every night without exception, regardless of weather or other conditions. This seasonal pattern established that the vigil was specifically a winter phenomenon, that it was tied to the long, dark nights of cold months rather than being a year-round presence. The light kept watch when watch was needed, when nights were long and dark and cold, when human families would have maintained fires and candles for warmth and illumination, and it rested during summer months when shorter nights made vigils less necessary. Over subsequent years, the light continued its winter appearances with absolute consistency. Every year from October through May, every night from sunset to midnight, the light burned in the Morrison cabin window. Every summer, from June through September, the cabin sat dark. The pattern never varied, never failed, never showed any deviation from its established schedule. The Morrison cabin acquired a reputation that was part wonder and part unease. Travelers passing at night would see the light and know they were near Cedar Ridge, using it as a landmark. But they would also know not to approach the cabin seeking shelter or assistance, understanding that the light represented not human hospitality, but something other, something that maintained its vigil for reasons that remained obscure. New families moving to the area would be told about the Morrison cabin and its winter light, would be warned not to disturb it or to attempt to interfere with whatever kept the vigil. The cabin itself was not considered dangerous. People who examined it during daylight or who entered it when the light was not burning reported no sense of threat or malevolence. But there was a shared understanding that the light should be respected, that whatever maintained it should be allowed to continue its watch without interference. In 1875, one of the Morrison children, a son named William who had moved to Kansas, returned to the area intending to claim the family cabin and to either occupy it or sell the property. He was informed about the light and its nightly appearances, and he initially dismissed the accounts as exaggeration or superstition. But after spending several evenings watching the light burn in his family's abandoned cabin, and after entering to find no source for the illumination, he concluded that the cabin was not suitable for occupation or sale. William left the property unclaimed and returned to Kansas, telling neighbors that he had no interest in living in a cabin where his mother's ghost apparently still kept house. Whether he genuinely believed Eleanor's spirit maintained the vigil, or whether he simply found the unexplained light too unsettling to live with, the result was the same. The cabin remained empty, and the vigil continued uninterrupted. Through the 1880s and 1890s, the Morrison cabin slowly deteriorated. The roof developed leaks, the chinking between logs crumbled, and the structure began to sag as foundations settled and wood rotted. But the light continued to appear with the same regularity, burning in a window of an increasingly decrepit building, maintained by a presence that showed no concern for the cabin's physical decline. By 1900, the cabin was clearly uninhabitable by any living person. The roof had partially collapsed, walls were leaning, and the interior was exposed to weather. But the light still burned in the south window during winter nights, visible through the gap where the window frame had once held glass, a steady glow emanating from a structure that was more ruin than building. The community debated whether the cabin should be torn down or simply left to collapse on its own. Arguments in favor of removal suggested that the deteriorating structure was an eyesore and potentially dangerous if children explored it. Arguments against removal suggested that interfering with the cabin might have unpredictable effects on the light and whatever kept it, that it was wiser to leave the vigil undisturbed even if the structure maintaining it was falling apart. The decision was made to leave the cabin standing, to let it deteriorate naturally rather than actively dismantling it. This decision was influenced partly by respect for whatever kept the vigil, and partly by a superstitious reluctance to interfere with something that had persisted for 30 years without causing harm beyond being inexplicable. By 1910, 40 years after the light first appeared, the Morrison cabin was little more than a pile of rotting logs with portions of walls still standing and the stone chimney intact. But the light continued to appear during winter nights, now visible as a glow among the ruins, no longer confined to a specific window, because no windows remained, but still present, still burning with the same steady warm illumination that had characterized it from the beginning. The location of the light within the ruins shifted over the years as the cabin's structure changed. It seemed to maintain a position that would have been near the south window when the cabin was intact, adjusting as walls fell and as the interior space became open to the elements, but still keeping to approximately the same spot relative to the cabin's original layout. In the 1920s, a decision was made to clear the site entirely, to remove the last remnants of the Morrison cabin and to reclaim the land for potential agricultural use. The chimney was dismantled, the rotting logs were burned, and the site was graded smooth, leaving only a slight depression where the cabin had stood and a scatter of stones that had formed its foundation. The community expected that removing the cabin would end the light's appearances, that whatever kept the vigil was tied to the structure itself and would have no reason or means to continue once the cabin was gone. But when winter came and the first cold nights arrived, the light appeared exactly where it had always appeared. A warm glow hovering in the air at the location where the south window of the Morrison cabin had once been, burning from sunset to midnight, as it had for more than 50 years. The light now floated in open air above the cleared ground, maintaining its vigil with no structure to shelter it, no cabin to contain it, no physical framework to explain its presence. It was purely light, disconnected from any material source, existing as a steady glow that appeared nightly through winter months and disappeared each summer with the regularity of a natural phenomenon, but with the purposefulness of a human routine. This transformation from a light burning inside a cabin to a light floating in open air made the phenomenon more obviously impossible and more clearly not explainable through any conventional understanding of how light worked. People could have convinced themselves that the cabin contained something that generated the light, some unknown chemical process, some unusual material property, some forgotten artifact that created illumination, but light that appeared in midair, that maintained a specific position relative to a structure that no longer existed, that followed a schedule determined by sunset and season. This could not be rationalized as anything other than impossible. The community adapted to this new impossibility, much as it had adapted to the original phenomenon. The light was noted, was watched, was incorporated into local knowledge and lore. It became a landmark that everyone knew, the Morrison Light or the Winter Light, something that defined the area and that newcomers were told about when they arrived. The site where the cabin had stood was left undeveloped, not through any formal agreement, but through shared understanding that the land where a light burned every winter night was not suitable for building or farming. Through the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s, the Morrison Light continued its nightly appearances during winter months, floating in air above the old cabin site, visible for miles as a steady point of warm illumination in the darkness. World War II brought changes to the area, brought young men away to service, and brought new families to occupy farms. But the light persisted, unaffected by human events, maintaining its vigil regardless of whether anyone who remembered Eleanor Morrison was still alive. By the 1960s, no one living had known Eleanor Morrison personally, and even memories of people who had known her were fading. The connection between the light and the woman who had presumably started the vigil was being lost to time, but the light continued, needing no memory, needing no living connection, maintaining its watch through an unbroken chain of winter nights that now stretched back nearly a century. Modern attempts to document and study the Morrison Light have been limited but consistent. Photographers have captured the light on film and digital sensors, confirming that it is not merely a subjective perception, but produces actual photons that can be recorded. The light registers in the visible spectrum as warm yellow-orange, consistent with candlelight or oil lamp illumination, with a temperature of approximately 2500–3000 Kelvin based on spectral analysis. Investigators have used thermal imaging to determine whether the light generates heat, finding that it produces no detectable thermal signature beyond what its visible light would generate. It does not heat the air around it as a flame would, suggesting that it is cold light similar to bioluminescence rather than incandescent light from combustion. But bioluminescence does not explain the light's warmth of color or its behavioral patterns. Measurements of the light's position over multiple nights confirm that it maintains an extremely precise location, varying by less than a few inches night to night, holding to a point in space that corresponds to where the south window of the Morrison cabin would have been at approximately 4 feet above the original floor level. This precision suggests either extremely sophisticated control or a genuine connection to the physical memory of the cabin's structure. The light's schedule has been documented across many years, confirming its relationship to sunset and its seasonal variation. It appears consistently 15 to 20 minutes after sunset as measured at the horizon, accounting for the area's elevation and terrain. It burns for a duration that correlates with the length of the night, maintaining its appearance for longer periods during winter solstice months and shorter periods during the transitional seasons of fall and spring. Scientific explanations for the Morrison light have been proposed and generally found wanting. Gas emissions from underground sources can create lights, but these typically flicker and move rather than maintaining a steady position and consistent schedule. Electrical phenomena can generate glows, but these require specific atmospheric conditions that do not correlate with the light's appearances. Biological processes can produce light, but no organism maintains a vigil on a sunset to midnight schedule for a century and a half. The most honest scientific assessment is that the Morrison light, as described and documented, should not exist. Light requires an energy source, requires a mechanism for conversion of energy to photons, requires a reason to appear in a specific location on a specific schedule. The Morrison light has none of these requirements satisfied by any known natural process, yet it continues to appear with the reliability of sunrise, kept by no living person, serving no apparent purpose, maintaining a vigil whose origin and meaning have been lost to time. The site where the Morrison cabin once stood is now part of a state conservation area, managed as natural land and accessible to hikers and visitors. The Morrison light is noted in some local histories and in folklore collections, though it is not widely known outside the immediate region. During winter months, people occasionally visit the site at sunset to watch the light appear, to witness the phenomenon that has persisted for more than 150 years, to see the vigil kept by no one living, and the light continues to appear. Every winter night from October through May, approximately 15 to 20 minutes after sunset, a warm glow manifests in the air above the site, where Eleanor Morrison once kept her household, where she lit candles to illuminate her evening tasks, where she maintained the rhythms of domestic life that frontier existence required. The light burns for hours in the darkness, steady and constant, then extinguishes itself around midnight, as if whoever tends it has finished their watch and retired for the night. No one knows why the vigil continues, what purpose it serves, or what would happen if it ever ceased. The light has burned through world wars and depressions, through the transformation of the frontier into modern rural America, through the deaths of everyone who knew Eleanor Morrison or remembered the cabin when it still stood. It persists as a connection to a past that is otherwise completely gone, maintained by a presence that requires no recognition, expects no gratitude, and shows no sign of ever abandoning its nightly watch. We have reached the end of this journey through one of the Ozark Plateau's most faithfully kept mysteries, a vigil maintained for more than 150 years by no living person, a light that burns every winter night in memory of a household that ceased to exist generations ago, a presence that tends its watch with perfect dedication, regardless of whether anyone remembers why the vigil began or understands what duty is being fulfilled. The winter vigil kept by no one living stands as a reminder that some obligations outlast the people who first assumed them, that some duties continue being performed long after their purpose has been forgotten, and that faithfulness to routine can persist beyond death, beyond decay, beyond the collapse of every physical structure, manifesting as a light that burns in darkness, not because anyone living requires it, but because someone who is no longer living has not yet concluded that the watch is complete. If you've made it this far on this journey through territory where lights burn without source and where vigils are kept by the dead, consider subscribing to Commutales for more stories that explore the boundaries between living duty and eternal watch, between household routine and ghostly persistence. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on what vigil you might keep beyond death, on whether you would visit the site to watch the light appear, on what it means when faithfulness outlasts memory and duty outlasts understanding. And if this story resonated with you, if it made you think about the lights you keep burning and whether they might continue after you're gone, a like helps bring these narratives to more people who appreciate mysteries that remind us that some watches are never concluded, some vigils are never ended, and that somewhere in the Ozark Plateau there is still a light that appears every winter night, kept by hands that have been dust for more than a century, burning for reasons that have been forgotten, fulfilling an obligation that no one living remembers, but that continues regardless, patient and faithful and eternal. Until our next journey into territories where the dead keep better watch than the living, and where lights burn in memory of households long dissolved, notice the lights that burn in winter windows. Wonder who maintains them and why. And remember that somewhere above an empty field where a cabin once stood, a light still appears each sunset from October through May, burns steady and warm through the darkness, and extinguishes itself at midnight, having fulfilled another night of a vigil that began more than 150 years ago, and that shows no sign of ending, kept by no one living, tended by faithful hands that exist now only as the light they continue to maintain. The only remaining evidence that Eleanor Morrison once lived here and once kept watch through winter nights and once established a routine so deeply ingrained that not even death could make her abandon it.